Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at the Atlantic magazine.
And I am Peter Suderman, a senior editor at Reason Magazine. Nice to talk with you, Conor.
Good to talk to you, too. Peter, between attending the DNC in Charlotte and the RNC in Tampa, I did a little road trip from Florida up to North Carolina and stopped in a couple of areas of Florida that have been hit really hard by the housing bust. And, talked to a bunch of people who are unemployed, and I was asking them about their political opinions, but, also they were talking back and asking me questions, and one of the questions was, is Washington going to do anything to help us? These were desperate people who wanted to know whether for themselves or for people in their community, if there was any help on the way, and they weren't for or against stimulus particularly. They were kind of, doubting whether anything could be done to help them. But it was occurring to me as I was hearing about this new QE3 that the Fed is doing, that had that been going on at the time, I would have had no idea how to explain to them what was going on. And what I mean is that I have kind of a vague understanding of it. In sort of the same way that I have a vague understanding of Spanish. I can understand some of it. I can speak some of it. I can get the gist of it. But I wouldn't want to translate someone verbatim, certainly. I wouldn't want to have to do anything very complex in this other language. And this is how I feel about QE3. And I feel like you have a better grasp on it than me. Can you explain QE3 to the Blogging Heads audience?
So I don't claim to be any deep expert on this either, but I'll do what I can here. One way to explain, or one short way to talk about QE3 might be to say that the Fed committed to support the economy with no end date. Another short way to say it might be that the Fed committed to print money with no, to print a certain amount of additional money and add to the money supply each month with no end date to this policy. What the Fed did is commit to expand its balance sheet, to buy debt, to expand the money supply, basically, yes, to create money out of thin air and expand the money supply. And the idea is kind of that if you put more money into the system and make interest rates even lower, people have a greater incentive to loan, to spend, to invest now, because money is both easier to get and because the value of holding on to your money is diminished since interest rates basically pay nothing. So this is something that Wall Street really likes. This is something that Wall Street has been looking forward to, and the idea is just to sort of to use loose money policy to make it easier to spend and invest, to create incentives to do so, and that hopefully in turn helps lower the unemployment rate. And so, the Fed has a dual mandate. On the one hand, it's supposed to pursue price stability, basically to keep inflation from going out of control. And on the other hand, it's also supposed to pursue, to keep unemployment at stable and low as well. And so traditionally, and a lot of people would say that the Fed has focused a little bit more on the inflation side of that mandate. And so you can think of certainly QE3 and maybe QE1 and QE2, which
and these are all rounds of this same thing, right? Yeah.
Right. So, which were similar earlier rounds of this policy, and like I said, the difference, which I probably should have mentioned up front, is that those earlier rounds had end dates. QE2 was a couple of month policy. This one, the Fed basically said we're going to continue to expand the money supply by a certain amount each month, not a huge amount. It's about $40 billion is sort of their floor, and they may adjust that, but not by a huge amount. And that we're not going to set an end date in advance. So basically, we're going to do what we need to do, or what we think we need to do to continue to support the economy and get the economy back on track.
So Peter, you're at Reason Magazine, a venerable hub of libertarian thought in America, and hearing you explain this and having read a little bit about it before, this sounds to me like the kind of thing that libertarians would hate. for a couple of reasons. One, because it's secretive Fed things, and they're just printing money, as if you can just do that, just print money. This seems like the critique you'd hear, and a lot of libertarians, of course, do dislike this policy. But it has some connection to a famous libertarian thinker, Milton Friedman. Can you explain that? Because I'm a little bit unclear on that.
I mean, Milton Friedman basically, Milton Friedman's theory was that theory. I shouldn't say that. One of the things that Milton Friedman is known for is his focus on monetary policy and on pushing on using monetary policy as a way to address certain types of economic problems. And so Friedman was more open than a lot of libertarians who are more Hayekian, who are more Austrian, who are more just generally skeptical of central bank policy. And what Friedman said was basically that a lot of the problems, the economic problems, over the past 100 years or so have stemmed from poor monetary policy. And so there's a certain sort of Friedmanite dimension here. And there are folks who are going to argue over whether Friedman would have supported this or not. Or just today, I've seen folks at prominent conservative think tanks say that Friedman would not have been happy with this, and that this puts us in alignment with exactly what Friedman would have wanted us to do. Folks who work at the same think tanks. So there's going to be a lot of disagreement over this. I don't know if I really quite want to call that one. I'm not sure that it's even worth doing, given that Friedman is not here to tell us.
Right.
But you can say that there's a Friedmanite origin to some of this, and that, at least as far as I'm concerned, libertarians should be willing to look at monetary policy and say, okay, given that we have a central bank, given that we have a Fed, and that it has the discretion that it does, all else being, given that we're in that situation, what else? Right. What should it be doing? What is the best type of policy? And I think a lot of libertarians just sort of start from the assumption, well, we just shouldn't have a Fed with this amount of discretion. We
right.
do, though, and so now that we do, are there better and worse decisions that the Fed can make? And so I think that's the practical question here that can be asked, that might, and where Friedman's views on monetary policy can actually help.
Yeah, well, I wish that I could offer some insight on the merits. Of course, I can't. And I would just note that it's a little bit uncomfortable that this main strategy for addressing the economic slump that we're in is something that a layperson can't really wrap their minds around. And I suppose some people would argue that is an inevitability in a complex global economy, and maybe that's so. It's still unnerving, I think, and a little bit more unnerving that Wall Street wants this.
I certainly think that is part of the historical wariness of a lot of people, not just libertarians, but certainly libertarian types and Ron Paul types, and but wariness about central bankers is that it's a lot of what they do is extremely complex, a little bit opaque. It happens outside of sort of direct voting. Ben Bernanke was not voted directly into his office, and so
right,
people
and we don't even get to know exactly what he does.
Right, and so that element of central banking helps to make people wary of it, helps to make people suspicious, and is what causes a lot of it. But it's sort of it's a feature of the way central banks work, And Bernanke, to his credit, has in fact tried to be more transparent than a lot of his predecessors, and to not perfectly so, and maybe there's more he could do, and also he has good. Presumably some understandable reasons, maybe not good reasons, but certainly understandable reasons for not having gone even further. But he's really tried to make it a somewhat more transparent institution that people can actually get answers out of, at least if they're looking for them.
Right, and so the takeaway for someone who's following the news and trying to figure out what in the world is going on with this QE3 is that the Fed has the ability to create money out of thin air, basically, and it is doing so and buying up a bunch of stuff in hopes of kickstarting the economy. And by a bunch of stuff, I mean perhaps mortgage-backed securities. I mean investment products. It's not going
buying up bonds and debt,
right.
And the idea is they expand their balance sheet, put money out into the economy.
And if this works,
money
then
starts by going into
kickstarts.
the accounts of into the accounts of big banks, basically.
So maybe this causes inflation. Yes. But if it doesn't work, then what's the big cost of this policy if it does not kickstart the economy?
Well, it's a little bit hard to say. So we like we said, we're on QE3. That means the third round of quantitative easing. So we've done this a couple times before. There's general, though not perfect, agreement that the first round of quantitative easing helped, and that took place right around the time of the financial crisis. And then there's less agreement about the overall effects of QE2, which took place a little while later, and what, if anything, that did. Did it have a big positive effect? Did it have a big negative effect? It's actually really hard to say. I don't want to say the consensus, but the strong view of many is that it didn't have that big effect. Big a positive effect. On the other hand, it's not clear to me that it's had much negative effect. However, there are folks who say that because it shoveled money into the system, which is sort of sitting socked away, it has made greater potential for inflation in the future, because once this money starts flooding the system, that's going to cause really serious inflation. And so you have the same sort of inflationary risk associated with a third round of quantitative easing. But again, it's not really clear how much benefit it's going to have, how much, or how much, what the negative effects might be, if any. The big difference here is that the Fed isn't setting an end date. And so what that does potentially is it says, somebody put it last time, put it recently was, the second round of quantitative easing we're going to expand the money and see if it works. And this time we're going to expand the money supply until it works. And so what it is basically doing is saying we are going to keep doing this until things get better. Now, a lot of folks have asked for a target for what getting better means. And so, until unemployment gets down to 5%, or it comes below 7% or something like that, right? And we didn't get a target. And so that potentially undermines some of the confidence effects, because you still don't know what getting better, what the economy getting better means. And Bernanke at the press conference basically said, well, we'll know it when we see it. It's an interesting situation to be in a presidential election year with the economy as the biggest issue, and two rounds of one of the main tools that the government is trying in order to improve the economy, and no one particularly agrees on whether it worked before. Certainly, the vast majority of citizens don't understand it. No one can really pinpoint exactly what risks are involved. And once we do it again, we won't necessarily be able to know if it worked or not. Right, because it's not just, it's not just the expansion of the money supply here. There was also guidance given about how long the Fed is going to keep interest rates at their current extraordinarily low rate. The Fed said we're going to extend that until 2015. So we have at least two factors coming out of the Fed. And so even if you can say, well, the Fed had an effect, it had whatever happens, it was the Fed's fault, or the Fed gets credit, then you don't even necessarily know which of the two parts, the expansion of the money supply, or the guidance saying we're going to keep interest rates low. You don't know which part had the effect, and so it's going to be very difficult. As with all things macro, with macro policy, it's always difficult to actually figure out what is causing what, and this is why there are Nobel Prizes awarded to in economics awarded to folks with like deeply divergent, fundamentally opposed views about how the macroeconomy works, because in many respects we just don't know, and there's not a consensus on a lot of these issues.
It's much the same as as another realm where the Nobel Prize is awarded, the Nobel Prize for Peace, and that's another topic that we're going to be discussing today. As we're recording, there's been some embassy unrest. There were 4 Americans killed in Libya, diplomatic staff at the embassy there, and the walls of the Egyptian embassy were breached. And I'm not going to say much more than that because there are a bunch of events swirling around, and I don't want to repeat anything now that it hasn't been quite confirmed. But we do know that these events, first of all, of course, are tragic for the people involved, and by any account of international relations, outrageous in that countries have a duty to protect the embassies of other countries, and that's pretty sacrosanct and basically universally accepted. This has become a big issue in the presidential election, with Mitt Romney coming out and criticizing the Obama administration for early statements that the Egyptian embassy put out, actually one statement before the attack, and then the Romney campaign has also criticized the Obama administration for how it's handled the aftermath, and also its whole foreign policy critique. And there's been an interesting meta debate as well, where some folks are saying that the Romney campaign has embarrassed itself, and other people are saying that, no, this is perfectly legitimate criticism. What are your thoughts about Romney's foreign policy and his critique of the Obama administration? Do you think it's effective? Do you agree with it? What's your perspective on that?
I guess I think two things about Mitt Romney's foreign policy. One is that, like virtually everything else, he views it through the lens of corporate consulting. If you read his book, No Apology, that title becomes important a little bit later. And the second thing I'm going to say, if you read his book, No Apology, it is interesting to see that the way he presents America's role in the world is basically like it's almost like watching a consultant's presentation about a company's role in the global marketplace. He says, there's a bunch of different strategies for achieving global dominance, and he goes through these strategies. There's the jihadist strategy, there's the Russian strategy, there's the Eastern, the Asian strategy. And sort of these are their strengths and their weaknesses. In America, we have this strategy that we've used historically, and this is our brand, and this is, sort of how our brand works, and this is what we're successful at. And part of our brand is that we're the global leader. And that's like that aspect, being the leader is in fact a big part of our brand and a big part of what makes us a successful product. And so it's just, it's almost funny to read this thing and like imagine him giving this 4-quadrant PowerPoint presentation, in which he shows the Russian strategy versus the jihadist strategy versus the American strategy, and why America is gonna win, the sales race in the global marketplace. And so it's deeply influenced by that kind of mindset in which America is competing with these other countries to win the market. And the second thing that I would say is that he has a really strong sense of no apology is very important. Is an important idea in his book. Not just it's the title, and it's that he has this strong sense that you shouldn't back down. That you should never be sort of you should never be apologetic or sympathetic, to what it is that your enemies are saying, and you should stand up to them. It's a very sort of blustery approach, an emphasis on bluster, as if bluster is an important, not just something that you should do, but an important aspect of his foreign policy. And you see that both in his in the way he talks about other countries, and in the way he has responded to Obama in this sense. These other places in the world are our competitors, and we should stand up to them. And that seems to really influence his thinking, is this idea that, that there are competitors and we should be blustery in saying that we're better and asserting our dominance.
Mm-hmm. One thing I find sort of confusing about Romney's comments about these embassy attacks and some of the conservative commentary I've been seeing, there seems to be this notion that if only President Obama were more unapologetic, say, that these sorts of things wouldn't happen. And, quite apart from the rest of Obama's foreign policy, I just don't understand this outlook on the world. The idea that a mob of people in one country or in Egypt, or what seemed to be possibly a more planned attack in Libya, the idea that presidential rhetoric of any kind would be the thing that prevented them from doing this, as if they would cower in their houses, thinking about the forthrightness with which Romney spoke and the resolve. I just don't understand it. It seems to me to impute much more power to presidential rhetoric than it actually has. It's not to say that presidential rhetoric is never important or that we shouldn't be saying the right things, and that's a whole different argument about whether Obama's saying the right things. But I just don't buy it as a root cause or a proximate cause of this kind of violence that we're seeing. I think it's as mistaken as identifying, they hate us because we had troops in Saudi Arabia as a root cause. I don't think you can draw this rational line, if this then that, with these kinds of foreign events.
Well, a lot of political analysis and even more, I think, political sentiment amongst within the general populace, the non-political professionals, really does revolve around what you want from the president, and it just sort of has. There's this idea that the president himself and what he says is the center of all things, especially all things diplomatic, and that it's almost and there's just this idea that the president is the most important thing, and what we know about the president is that he says stuff. That's how we all interact with him, is that he gives speeches and we understand what he said and whatnot. And so that there's just a huge, huge weight given to presidential speeches and given to the role of the president, when in fact, I mean, this State Department is gigantic, has outlets, has embassies everywhere, massive staff, massive sort of operation. And yes, the president is a hugely important figure in all of these things, but he's certainly not he doesn't have the kind of central, not just central, but sort of lonely role that a lot of people seem to imagine that he has in a lot of these foreign policy discussions.
Another thing I found really interesting about the way that the stories in Egypt and Libya unfolded is that the American media started talking about these attacks late at night. I forget exactly which night, but it was late one evening, right? And
right.
Romney made his statement that evening, and then Obama, wasn't out with his statement until the next morning. And
the issue with that was it was September 11th, and Romney sent out, and Romney and Obama had agreed to basically suspend campaign bickering for September 11th, and Romney sent out his statement on the evening of September 11th, but it was embargoed until midnight, and of course that embargo didn't last, and he,
okay, got it.
And folks said, yeah, look, you're doing this on September 11th as you promised not to do.
Okay, well, what struck me about it were the demands for Obama to make a statement on the substance of the Egyptian situation and the Libyan situation. Like there was upset in some quarters that he didn't do it until the next morning. And it just it sort of blows me away that we're now not just expecting that our president might respond at Twitter speed, but demanding it and saying, he's derelict in his duty, that he went to bed before making a statement.
Hey, man, the CNN has somebody on 24 hours a day. They're always making statements, saying stuff. Right. Why can't the president? That's what this is how people interact with politics, right? It's like their interaction with it is the constantly on 24-hour news cycle. It's all Twitter and cable news. And so my sense is that there's an expectation that the presidency acts accordingly.
Yeah, and I think actually I wish that a president or at least a spokesman would push back. Not in this particular instance. I don't care about any particular instance so much, but in general, push back against this expectation rather than caving to it. Because sometimes it makes sense to wait and see how events unfold for another few hours. Sometimes it makes sense to just think about how you're going to respond and what the best way to respond is. And there's really no advantage to responding quickly in a lot of instances. Sometimes there is, of course, but in a lot of instances, this expectation isn't being driven by any advantage of a quick response. It's just being driven by our expectations about media diet
Yeah, the one thing I would say to that, though, is that while it can certainly be a mistake to jump the gun and make a strong statement, take some strong position very early, you do, the administration does need to let people know that it is watching, that it is engaged, that it is aware of situations, and that that it's in the process of formulating whatever response is best.
President Obama is going to address this tomorrow or the day after tomorrow.
It's not as if the White House wouldn't be paying attention to events like we've seen this week, right? We know that they have to be on it, that they are on it, that it is something they are thinking about. But people do need to sort of have that a little bit of comforting. Sign flag waving, saying yes, we're here, yes, we're working on it. I mean, it's like it's like if your utility goes out, it's much preferable to have someone to communicate to you. Maybe I don't know what the exact problem is. Maybe I don't know when your electricity is going to come back on, but we do have people who are working on the problem right now, and that's better than no response.
I might be more annoyed if President Obama said, "I'm going to make a statement about this between 3 and 6 o'clock tomorrow. Please just tune in for that entire interval."
Yes, and then he never showed up.
Yeah, and then he never showed up. Oh man. So another part of this controversy has been that so there's apparently this movie put out that was insulting to Islam, and this is one of the reasons that people are protesting around the embassies. And it's a little bit unclear actually whether this movie is being used as a pretext, or whether there actually is outrage caused by this movie that insulted Islam that was made by an American filmmaker. And the Obama administration has been in this position where there are kind of two competing things going on. One, it wants to, stand up for the idea of free speech and basically condemn the idea that an appropriate reaction to any speech, no matter how offensive, is violence. On the other hand, it wants to be conciliatory in the way that all diplomatic operations are, and it wants to basically say, yeah, there's some terrible things in this video. It's not the position of the United States. In fact, we disagree with it. And this is a tension that really came to the fore in public debate with the cartoons in Denmark that prompted a lot of outrage among Muslims there. There were cartoons that portrayed the Prophet Muhammad, some of them satirically, and this is verboten to portray Muhammad in the Muslim faith. And so, there are ultimately attacks on this newspaper, And there's a big debate about whether this kind of speech should be allowed, whether it's hate speech. And I guess I'll let you weigh in a minute. But the way that I feel about this is that we should absolutely stand behind the right of people to say anything, and that we have to defend free speech. I don't think that means that we can't acknowledge that some things are offensive or that they don't represent the official position of the United States. But I would like to see actually a more explicit and forthright defense of free speech from the Obama administration, from the U.S. government generally in this way. I think it's actually helpful to cite and explain the First Amendment and our notions of free speech, because there are so many places in the world where the fact that something is broadcast in the media is reflective of the fact that the government supports it. I think it's important to be out there saying, look, this is how we think about free speech in America. The hands of this administration are tied in that the Constitution prohibits us from doing anything about this. In other words, the more that we explain our tradition of free speech, the less it seems to other people as if offensive statements are the United States attacking them as opposed to some random guy attacking them.
I guess the operative thing for me here is, I really liked what my boss, Matt Welch, wrote about this. And what he basically said is that the government's position on these things should simply be to say, we are not in the business of approving or disapproving or any kind of speech at all. Just because something has been produced does not mean we approve it, does not mean we disapprove it. We don't censor it. We're not the ones who are reviewing this, who are making it, and that is the way it should be. And that is what the government should be doing. And that is the position it should be taking. And defending defending the government's non-involvement in speech production, and that should be the primary thing. And I think you're right, and that it is entirely possible to both defend free speech and defend it sort of in principle and defend the legal aspect, and to say that something is patently offensive. Mm-hmm. But I don't think. I guess I should say how much the government should be getting involved in those judgments. My preference is for the government to be making those judgments in an official way as little as possible, and that it shouldn't be involved in making those judgments publicly and in an official capacity if it can be avoided. What the government should be saying is, this is not what we're in the business of doing. We simply don't censor speech. We don't review it. This is no speech that is produced except through the official organs of government are the official positions of government, period, the end. And people are going to say and what we do is protect the right of our citizens to say whatever it is they want, period.
Certainly that standard you're setting forth, right, it has this benefit that if you refuse to weigh in on the merits of any speech, then you're not pressured to weigh in on the merits of all speech, right? And so there's a sense in which it takes the government out of the position of having to defend something that's actually unpopular abroad, but that it does in fact think is correct or is defensible, right? And I think that I share your discomfort with the government making a lot of judgment calls as well. I would say, though, that that standard, even stepping outside the realm of speech, is a pretty huge departure from what we're used to in diplomacy, both in the United States and abroad. And what I mean by that is, while I'm fully on board with defending the First Amendment and laying forth, explaining what it is and the reasons behind it and why, I totally agree with Matt Welch that the government should say we are neither in the business of, affirmatively permitting the speech of our citizens or denying them the right to speak, right? I think that's a very important message. But you could think of all sorts of instances, right, where just to create a hypothetical, say, imagine that a British citizen, President Obama was in London and a British citizen who was like, had some low-level government position. I mean, he was the guy that gave out like parking meter tickets or something in London, right? And say that he threw an apple at President Obama. Say that he, threw a piece of paper wrapped around an apple and it had some kind of racist cartoon on it or something. If the British ambassador issued a pro forma apology to the United States and said, we're so sorry for the terrible message that this guy threw at President Obama. No one in the United States would think, oh, the British government is weak. No one in the United States would think, oh, the British government is apologizing for free speech or doesn't stand up for free speech, right? We would just think this is how diplomacy works. They're smoothing over this international incident. A lot of people are going to be hearing about it in the United States third hand, and people are going to have a little bit better feeling about Britain if they see in the same newspaper story about the British people that were hurling things at President Obama that the British ambassador said, British people love it when American leaders visit, and we're terribly sorry for this incident, right?
But the analogy doesn't quite hold up because that is, that's borderline assault, even if it's, a Nerf football rather than an apple, but and it's directed very specifically at the president. The analogy is more like if some random filmmaker in London decided to, make an ultra low budget digital video, a home movie posted to YouTube. It was offensive to Obama, and they decided then to apologize for that. That would seem actually be
I agree.
Not something that the British diplomatic corps should spend a lot of time doing.
I agree that my example was not an analogy of the situation in Egypt and Libya. I intended it only as a response to the idea that governments should never weigh in on the merits of the speech or actions of its citizens, right? There are some instances, I think, when governments are within the realm of appropriate behavior if they make a judgment call that some...
But the position isn't even judging... It's not so much judging the speech itself. It's answering the question of, is this the position of our government? And the answer is no, it's not the position of our government. Our government is not, does not formally approve or disapprove of any speech made by our citizens. No, it's not the position of. So you definitely can do that, but you need to go further. Is that the
okay? So here's another example, right? And we'll see how you feel about this one.
And again, I say that in a sort of, I'm talking about formal public capacity. I obviously understand that, that in a private capacity, diplomats will, of course, say, I find that offensive. And that seems much less problematic to me.
Right. And also, it's a tricky area because is the Twitter feed of a random embassy that very few people follow a private capacity or a public capacity? And it's not exactly clear because, it depends on how far it's spread, I guess. But
increasingly, the State Department is using tools like Twitter to get its message out across, in other parts of the world. I actually heard a presentation on this by a State Department official pretty recently, and they really think of Twitter and tools like that as pretty key ways to get their message out.
So imagine that in a country like, say in Morocco or in Iraq or any number of countries where there is at least some hardcore public sentiment against the United States, right? And in a public square on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, let's say that a bunch of protesters, including some low-level government people, like a couple of local police officers maybe even some like federal employee who works for the Ministry of Health or something, they're out there and they erect a kind of effigy of the Twin Towers and they fly a little fake plane into it and celebrate the deaths of the Americans and chant anti-American slogans and burn American flags, or maybe they don't even burn American flags. Whatever they do, it's within the realm of what would be protected by our First Amendment, right? And let's say that this country has progressed to a level where it too respects free speech in this way. It has some institutional safeguard against free speech. So if that foreign government, if the American ambassador to the United States from Morocco or from Egypt or from whatever country, if the statement that guy put out was, that there was this protest and it upset a lot of Americans, and we are not in the business of telling our citizens what they should say or they shouldn't say, but this is not the position of the Moroccan government, and we find the message that they sent offensive, and we have the highest respect for the innocent people who died on 9/11, right? Would that be an inappropriate abridgment of free speech, or would that be an okay conciliatory gesture?
I prefer. It's hard to imagine that particular circumstance, given that those sorts of that free speech protections like we have in the United States don't exist in countries where that sort of thing happens. And so, what would that circumstance look like? But again, if you have another country that is equally protective of free speech rights, and that has shown a commitment to that in a really robust way, and is generally, and I say generally on purpose, supportive of sort of basic civil liberties and freedoms, then I feel like it's important to distance your governments from statements like that, to make it clear this is not the position of the government. But citizens in the United States understand that free people who are allowed free speech rights will say things that are incredibly offensive to them, and that is part of the deal, and that governments don't need, as a matter of course, to go any further than making clear what the government's position is, and then staying the hell out of what their citizens are saying.
I
until it gets, if it is actually limited to speech, not obviously violence, and obviously anything more than that. But if it is actually limited to speech, then a society that has a true commitment to it will generally seek to exercise as little influence over saying what is and isn't acceptable speech as possible.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just think that the societies that have this wonderful norm, right, it's inside those societies that this understanding that it isn't the official position of the government.
But societies outside of the United States don't have the kind of norm that we have in the United States. I mean, even in many of our Western allies, there are opportunities for government censorship and for government to step in and block speech that just don't exist here because of the robustness of the First Amendment.
Right, and again, this is something that this lack of robustness, right, in say France or Britain, this actually hurts them in some ways in this realm, right, because people can point to them and say, you don't have First Amendment, you could block this speech if you wanted to. I'm not that familiar with the specific laws in these countries, but what I mean to say is, once you say we're able to censor anything, we're able to censor hate speech, you invite people to pressure you to censor things that shouldn't be hate speech. But back to what I was trying to say before, I guess if people in all of the countries that are embassies might say, hey, look, we find this offensive and it isn't the position of the United States. If people in those countries had the understanding that most Americans have about the First Amendment and about the free speech norms that prevail here, I think that I would agree with your position. And I think we ought to do a better job of explaining those norms and broadening public understanding of them. But as long as there's widespread ignorance about the actual relationship between speech and the United States government, it seems to me that it is appropriate for embassies to step in and clarify that.
Yeah, no, I don't think that there's anything wrong with an embassy clarifying how the United States, clarifying and in fact, spreading the news, the word, explaining as much as possible how the United States does think about free speech and what rights it gives its citizens, and what the government's role is and isn't. Because you're right, those conceptions are not commonly understood, but I think I feel like that's what I'm saying, that the government's position should be: we do not approve or disapprove of speech. Period. We're not going to, and we shouldn't.
Right.
And perhaps not exactly that forceful, but like that should be the message of explanation, which is that speech that is produced by our citizens does not represent the approved or disapproved speech of the United States government in any way, and
Right.
that's our system. And yes, it is hard to conceptualize, I think, for folks who have never lived under a system like that. But in fact, if the more they can, I think there's a lot of value in helping people to conceptualize speech that way.
Yeah.
And speech rights that way.
So let's move on to healthcare. It's a beat that you've covered a great deal, and I'm curious to know. We kind of look like what healthcare. We kind of know what healthcare policy will look like if President Obama is reelected. What?
Yes.
Okay. So what if Romney's elected? What do you think will actually happen? Will there be total repeal of Obamacare? What things does he like, or what things will he keep, whether because he wants to or because there's political pressure to? What do you think?
A little tough to say, because as with all things policy, Mitt Romney has been fairly vague about what he would do, and I'm not even sure that I trust the explicit promise that he has made to repeal Obamacare. Especially because that, even if he's serious about it, and I'm not at all convinced that he is, even if he's serious about it, it's going to be very hard to get a PPACA repeal bill through Congress and to his desk. And I think that part of the reason that not the only reason, but part of the reason he's willing to make that promise is that he understands exactly how difficult it's going to be to get Congress to pass a full repeal. So, I think that it's highly likely that you end up with a sort of federalist, at least in the short term, with a sort of federalist implementation of the law, in which, thanks to the Supreme Court's decision, states can opt out of the law's Medicaid expansion without any penalty. There's some question about what happens if states decline to set up their own health insurance exchanges. In theory, the federal government is supposed to step in, but there's not really any funding for it, and it's not clear. There's a pretty strong case, I think, that the federal government is not actually allowed to disperse subsidies for health insurance through a federally run exchanges, which would make federal exchanges dramatically different in kind, if they could even find money to set them up. And so there's going to be some big problems potentially with setting up federal exchanges, and states can also opt out of the Medicaid expansion. And so if you have a bunch of states that have opted out of the Medicaid expansion and opted out of creating their own exchanges, and the federal government, at least I think it's quite likely that for the first couple of years, it's going to take a while to get at the federal government's role in creating federal exchanges sorted out. Mm-hmm. So you may have this situation in which some states are basically setting up Obamacare and running it more or less as the folks who passed it kind of thought would happen. And then a bunch of states, a handful of states anyway, are just not doing much. And so then what happens with things like the individual mandate, or the citizens in those states that have opted out of the Medicaid expansion and the exchanges still subject to the mandate? Well, with President Romney, and with if you have Republicans, if you have a Republican Senate, Republican-dominated House, you can see a lot of opportunity for tweaking the law and sort of creating additional leeway for the states that want to opt out. And in fact, what Romney has promised, what he said is, I know that there's not going to be a repeal bill on my desk day one, so I'm going to use the law's waiver provisions to sort of give waivers to states that want them. Well, there are a lot of problems with that. Phil Klein has done a very good job of, Phil Klein at the Washington Examiner has done a very good job of detailing a lot of the problems with that. But what it suggests is that he might be willing to work with states to give them even more leeway to basically not do what Obamacare is asking them to do, and to allow them to get them off the hook for various rules in the law. And so you might just end up with a situation in which some states are pursuing it and some states aren't, and it's kind of up to the states.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Well, I'm very curious to see not only what happens, but how the Republican Party reacts to what happens. And I guess I should say how the Republican rank and file reacts to what happens. One of the things that really surprised me, actually, about going to the RNC was that I expected to see more of a Tea Party presence there. I expected that there would be some kind of shout out to the Tea Party in the same way that there was a shout out to Ron Paul during the proceedings. And, I didn't literally sit in the hall for every second, so maybe I missed something. But as far as I could see, and as far as I've heard or read, the Tea Party went virtually unmentioned at the Republican National Convention. And, of course, Romney was a disappointment to a lot of Tea Partiers, and they've now rallied around him on the theory that he's better by their lights than Obama. He probably is, by their lights, better than Obama. I wonder how they're going to react when what I regard as the inevitable disappointments and misrepresentations come to be known. How long a honeymoon period would a President Romney have with the Republican base?
Well, there's a good chance, I think, at this point that we won't get to find out because Romney won't be elected. It's a little tough to say. You can tell to some extent by how they've reacted to the compromises that Republicans, have already made, to the fact that, we did raise the debt limit, as a lot of Tea Party types didn't want to what they've already seen. They've already gotten a lot more savvy to the compromises that are just required of governance. And, the lack of shout out, I think, is in part because of this integration that we've seen between the Tea Party and Republican leadership. Tea Party has more or less been institutionalized into the Republican, especially in the House, but it's increasingly happening in the Senate, sort of into the Republican mainstream. And it's hard to separate. Yes, there's certainly Republicans who are not part of the Tea Party, but it's actually hard in a lot of ways to separate those two groups out, whereas it used to be, it's very clear there was sort of Republican mainstream leadership, John Boehner is whatever, and then there was the Tea Party, and now there's a lot more sort of cross-pollination and integration between those two groups, and so it's not as if, which is not the case with, say, a lot of the Ron Paul types, which may be why there was a shout-out to Ron Paul, sort of acknowledgement of them, because they are an outsider group in a lot of ways. Ron Paul has certainly been influential with certain parts of certain aspects of the Republican Party on issues like the Fed and a few other things. But his supporters have not integrated in the same way that just the Tea Party activists and Tea Party leaders have integrated into the Republican base.
They might leave. They might not actually vote Republican in November. The Ron Paul people, they're more likely to stay home than Tea Partiers. They're more likely to, flee to Gary Johnson than Tea Partiers, especially if Ron Paul got angry and told them to.
You look at the Republican Party, what it is, sort of the shape of it, what its plank, its broad goals insofar as it has them, and you compare them now with 2008, and you can very much see the influence of the Tea Party and the way the Republican Party has incorporated a lot of that in. And so why give them a shout out? A shout out is sort of it ends up being a pat on the head and saying, that's nice, we're happy that you're with us. They weren't with them, they were part of them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's do our last topic, which is Jay-Z, and particularly this Zadie Smith piece that was it in the New York Times Magazine? Is that where it was?
It was in the T magazine. It was not. It was in the New York Times about a different magazine publication, I believe.
Okay. Well, anyway, wherever it was, Zadie Smith is always a great nonfiction writer to read, and this was a relatively short by her standards profile of Jay-Z. They went to lunch. He ordered a fish sandwich for her. And the part of the profile, at least one of the parts, well, I guess I should say, by way of background for people who are a little bit less familiar with Jay-Z, he's basically one of the most incredible stories in the United States, I would say, both as a recording artist and as a sort of rags to riches success story. The guy's worth twice as much as Mitt Romney, basically, and came from nothing. Started out selling drugs in a housing project in Bed-Stuy, and he's just had, there are a lot of rags to riches stories in the entertainment realm, of course. I don't know that there's really precedent for what Jay-Z has done, though. He's certainly done it on a bigger scale than just about anyone else you can think of, and at least when you look at the difference from where he started out and where he's gotten to. His albums over the course of his career, and I'm sure that there are hardcore Jay-Z fans who would dispute some of the details here, but his albums basically started off talking about drug dealing and talking about being on the streets of Bed-Stuy, and slowly over time, as he has moved away from that lifestyle and is in fact basically the polar opposite of it now, there's been a transformation in his music. And at first he transitioned from talking about the street to kind of exploring more the emotions of people and telling narrative stories and creating different characters. His most famous song, 99 Problems, tells the story of a guy who gets pulled over by the cops and has stuff has drugs in the trunk and is thinking through his Fourth Amendment rights so he's created a lot of characters. He's done a little bit of narrative in his rap, and most recently he's done these collaborations with Kanye West. Watch the Throne, and I think that there's another Kanye collaboration album that's going to come out, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway.
Oh, yes, although it's my understanding is that Jay-Z is not, is that it's basically a Kanye album that has some Jay-Z on it rather than a true just sort of Jay-Z-Kanye collaboration.
Got it. So anyway, Jay-Z's last album, the true collaboration with Kanye, Watch the Throne, is what you could term luxury rap. It's basically two fantastically successful guys rapping, basically boasting in the way that a lot of rap includes boasts as a basic part of the vernacular, but boasting about the luxury lifestyle that they live and talking about, getting drunk in Paris and driving around in their Maybach and flying around on Gulfstream private jets. And,
as people do. Yeah.
Right. And so
I can really relate to that.
It is a natural culmination of the rags to riches story, right? It's the ultimate culmination of it. But it begs the question, what does Jay-Z do next? And I think that he has an opportunity to do something that not very many rappers have done, which is to I think that there are a lot of really talented rappers. Eminem is a really good example, who has sort of a thing that he does, a thing that he raps about. With Eminem, it's his terrible childhood and how he hates his ex-wife and loves his daughter and has problems with his mother, and then at the end, and then he's done a little bit about how he has this uncomfortable relationship with fame, right? And at least for me, I think Eminem is technically genius, but there's only so many times you can tell that story in so many different songs when it doesn't get tiresome and derivative. And Jay-Z has kind of managed this by making poppier songs and by recording things like Empire State of Mind and like Run This Town, that are great songs and that are sort of the culmination of telling his story in the case of Empire State of Mind, but tying it to New York City as a whole and making it a little bit wider in its appeal for that reason, right? What he's never done, what no one has ever done, is really explore what it's like to be in the elite in a way that doesn't just glorify it. And what I mean is that Jay-Z didn't just glorify drug dealing. He might have done that a little bit more in his first couple of albums than he did in his later albums, but really, he explored drug dealing. He talked about the good sides of it and the bad sides of it, and he was a storyteller, and he was getting inside of characters, and he was grappling with it, I guess is what I want to say. He has never grappled with fame. He's never grappled with luxury. He's never grappled with the life that he currently leads, or really ever gotten even below the surface of the luxury lifestyle that he leads. One thing that Jay-Z said in the profile with Zadie Smith is he talked about how basically, as he put it, having a black president made the role of the hustler and the imaginations of black youth a little bit less important. In other words, when Jay-Z was coming up, there was no one in his world that he could look to and think, I could be fantastically successful that way. The only way he could see to be successful in a way that squared with his ambitions was to start out as a drug dealer, right? So that was one thing he said that was of interest to me. And another thing he said was talking about the life that his daughter is going to have. He talked about how she wasn't going to have to be nearly as tough as him, nearly as willing to do some things that are morally objectionable as he did. What she's going to have to do is learn how to be an intelligent, moral person who navigates the world and achieves her potential. That isn't an exact quote, but it gets across what he was saying about her, right?
Right.
So this is a guy who really uniquely almost in American life is able to kind of survey everything from the housing projects and the way that he grew up to really the extremity of being in the 1%, as they call it, of living this luxury lifestyle and flying all over the world.
0.1%, 0.0001%
right.
In his case, yeah.
Exactly. He can see the whole spectrum, right? And once you're in that elite, it's very hard to critically comment about it, right? Because you're alienating business partners, you're alienating people that you like, people that you hang out with, at least if you, depending on your critique and how biting you are about it. And it gets to the question of, does Jay-Z want to just keep making a bunch of money, which he can certainly do, or is his ambition going to transcend money? Because once you're a relatively young man like he is, and you've made twice as much money as Mitt Romney, how much more can money do for you, really? So if Jay-Z could explore the being a member of the elite, or even making the transition from where he came from to being a member of the elite, if he can reflect on that with anything like the nuance that he reflected on the life of drug dealing, it would be a phenomenal and unprecedented album, I think, that I would love to see.
So a reflection on wealth, income, and inequality by America's foremost rapper?
Yeah, basically. It doesn't have to be a reflection on inequality, right?
I mean, I feel like the New Yorker would publish that.
What it ought to be, right? I don't want him to critique income inequality in America or something.
Can there be graphs? There should be graphs.
I don't care. I don't care what his message is. I don't care if his message is, I earned this, and this is why I feel entitled to it, and these are the things I'm doing. I don't care if he's not talking about himself, if he's inhabiting characters that he comes across, right? I just want him to have a little bit of, there's a little bit of Tom Wolfe in Jay-Z when he's talking about drug dealing, right? He's going into the subculture, he's describing it, he's poking fun at parts of it, he's extolling parts of it as well. That's all I want to see. I want to see him grappling with this new world he's in, instead of just reflecting back on the old world that he came from.
I also am in favor of Jay-Z turning into a gonzo journalist.
Yes. Yeah. So do you have anything to say about this Zadie Smith piece?
I would be fascinated by the transformation, by watching the transformation that you have described here. What I have enjoyed most about Jay-Z's transformation over the years is the way he has become sort of safe and almost suburban in a way that's like really kind of pleasant and comforting. There's like this there's this this like sort of upper middle class suburban dad kind of feel about his more recent albums. That
really?
I find myself weirdly attracted to, and I'm just like, oh, you're making like warm, friendly radio pop. That's great. I want to listen to this in my minivan while I'm driving to the grocery store. And it's totally wonderful, and he pulls it off. And I don't mean that, yes, it's a little funny, but I don't mean that in any negative way at all, because it's totally wonderful. And he does that. He does that thing with the same level of wit and excellence that he did, project rap that he told his stories, when in the 90s when he was very young and had a very different vibe. And the excellence with which he has, that he has carried into, the various personas that he has inhabited, and the excellence of craft. He started out as somebody who you were impressed by his technical skills as a rapper, but now what's impressive, yes, it's still his technical skills as a lyricist, but his ability to craft engaging, high quality pop. His radio pop. I mean, about the only person who competes with him is Kanye West, who he's now collaborating with, and and it's this sort of vision for pop excellence that he has is just incredibly impressive, and I find it totally wonderful. Even as I said, now that his persona is, just I'm like, oh, I want to be strapping something into a car seat.
Wait, I don't understand. I mean, I understand. I agree that he has taken pop, that he does pursue pop excellence. He's not sold out the integrity of the quality of what he's doing as he's moved from more kind of hardcore rap, for lack of a better term, to more poppy commercial enterprises, right? But I don't quite get the suburban dad angle. I mean, unless you're just saying that you associate suburban dads with liking high quality pop as opposed to schlocky terrible, like low quality pop. What about the Blueprint 3 or Watch the Throne suggests suburban dad to you?
Okay, so Watch the Throne a little less so, but I mean, his most recent, the stuff that he has done independently. The most recent Blueprint album, it's almost hard for me to describe, but the whole thing just has such a sort of a friendly suburban feel to it. Maybe it's just what I associate Top 40 radio with, and that might have something to do with it. But
it's interesting, right? Because the song "Forever Young" could totally, his cover of "Forever Young," or I guess his sampling of "Forever Young," that could totally be, and probably is, like a suburban prom song, right? And so I sort of see what you mean with that. But like on Blueprint 3, right? It's funny. There are some lyrics that are edgier than what I associate with suburbia. Maybe it's a parody of edginess, right? But like in the song "Thank You Very Much," there's the line. He's basically dissing other rappers, and the metaphor that he uses is, what is it? They put a building up as well. It's basically a World Trade Center metaphor. That these guys' albums are so bad, it's like they built two buildings, and then a plane crashed into them, and then they came crashing down, and then rescue workers came to the site and breathed the toxic fumes into their lungs and got terribly sick. And this is what he wanted these rappers to feel. I mean, so I don't know.
So maybe this is. Let me see if I can explain it this way. and this is probably going to be the best I can do. But
Yeah.
in the way that all of the out there edgy hippie rock of the late 1960s, early 1970s eventually became the music that our parents listened to as they drove us to soccer practice.
Yeah.
Jay-Z has become the same thing.
I agree.
And has inhabited that and done and not just done it in a way that's sort of like oh, that's cute, but like it's done a really remarkable job of maintaining incredibly high levels of craftsmanship.
He compares himself to Sinatra, and that's not so far off.
Jay-Z has become, he's become part of the pop establishment and part of the respectable pop establishment, and he's brought a lot of his contemporaries and a lot of the folks who were who are sort of in his orbit along with him, and so that same sort of thing has happened. It's almost like the way that the Republican Party has incorporated the Tea Party, and they've sort of brought the edgy outsiders into the establishment, and now they're all part of it. And so that is what I guess that's what I see happening here with Jay-Z, and what I'm talking about is just the same thing that happened to the music that my parents listened to when they were in college and their parents hated and thought was, oh, this is terrible, this is so offensive, and it was designed to provoke people and all this stuff. It eventually became, conventional, middle-aged radio rock that has more or less happened to Jay-Z, as his career has progressed.
Yeah, okay. I buy that. All right, well, we should close out. We're over an hour, but it's been fun, and we should do it again sometime soon.
Indeed. Nice talking to you, Connor.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.